Go for
Welcome
it.
back, Peter.
Thank you. Different kind of review this time around, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this one was a bit of a long book.
Yeah.
No, but it's very good.
Mm.
Okay, so podcast episode 4.
Yeah.
And the book is Black Box Thinking. So the subtitle that we have is Marginal Gains and the Secrets of High Performance by Matthew Syed. And then there's a few different titles, it turns out. So there's black box or subtitles. It's Black Box Thinking, Black Box Thinking, Black Box Thinking. But Black Box Thinking, The Surprising Truth About Success. And then also Black Box Thinking, Why Most People Never Learn from Their Mistakes, but some do. Yeah.
Okay.
Should we do a book summary?
Yeah, quick one. To where I got to. Yeah, I'll go for it. No, it was it's an interesting book. Not was an interesting book. I'd really like to finish it. I didn't get
What? No way.
so bear with me this time around. Didn't get that much into it. Rough month, but yeah. No. There was some interesting thing that jumped out at me. Which, when you think about it, I think we usually ignore, and the one thing being how we treat failure. It's very interesting that, as with many things, it always takes some mentorship. You just have to change your perspective on how you view certain things, and one of which is highlighted in this book is how we perceive failure. And I should say the one section of the book that caught my attention was they were talking about one of the wars, and they were analyzing planes that that had returned. And when I looked at the image that they had showed, I had the same idea that the people also were presented this picture, like, if these planes came back, they took a lot of damage here, meaning that we should protect those areas. And later on they said no, but if you actually think about it, the ones that got hit in the areas that have zero bullet holes mean that they're the ones that went down, so it's having that shift to invert
Perspective and
your
that, yeah.
perspective to say, if the plane came back and that's where there are no bullet holes, then we need to protect that, for it not to come down. Like, just the ability to identify that, I mean, to me, it was mind-blowing. And I was like, okay, like,
Yeah.
you think about, like, why was I on this page? And, like, when they said that, I think he was a mathematician. When he recommended that, I was like, wow, like, I never thought about it. But it was, like, very true,
Yeah.
So
Covering the places that weren't hit is the solution, which is very counterintuitive. It's obvious once you reason through it, because okay, the places that were hit, they went, or if they weren't hit and they came back,
it means
that it's because that place wasn't hit. That's why they survived.
Yeah.
And obviously that then leads to the conclusion that those people that didn't come back must have been hit in that area. Whereas the initial focus is the bullet holes in the wings and this and that.
Yeah.
Those are the places where we needed
to protect,
put the protection on, because the planes that came back had bullet holes in the wings.
Yeah.
But then shifting that perspective and saying, when they have bullet holes in the wings, it actually turns out it's fine. They can still fly back.
They can handle that damage.
But when you get a bullet hole through your body, then it's a problem.
It's a problem, So I think that for me kind of summed up what I read, to be like, we kind of need to have I want to say like an outsider's perspective on certain things, try to put yourself out of the situation and look at it differently. And I mean, that goes about to some of the different things that they spoke about. For instance, how failure in the medical sector is treated. It's like it's frowned upon, and as a result, that's one area in which hasn't improved much as a result of kind of understanding why something failed. I mean, they talk about the poor feedback loop there is when it comes to like X-rays. How people misdiagnose patients from the X-rays, but there's never feedback loop later on to be like, listen, you actually misdiagnosed this patient. Let's reanalyze the X-rays. It's just one of the things that falls away, and as a result, there isn't that improvement in radiology when it comes to understanding how failure can improve how they diagnose
Yeah.
patients. And I mean, the book speaks a lot about aviation, all the sections that I read, how that's one field that has thrived through failure, to be where they are now. Planes had to go down, they had to critically analyze what went wrong to kind of better improve their systems to where aviation is now.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I just think many sectors and many areas, and I mean, us as human beings, just I think need to kind of adopt that into our own lives as well. That we don't see failure as a bad thing. Not that we should condone failure. We need to work our hardest to deliver what we need to, but in those moments where we make mistakes, we need to be open to that feedback. It might come across as criticism, but there is always constructive criticism. We need to learn from some shortfalls, and I think that will improve our lives in many aspects.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can go for it. I think that's my
Cool.
2 cents.
No, that was helpful. Okay, yeah. So the summary from our side is basically that black box thinking by Matthew Syed at its core is about learning from failure. In aviation, there's the idea of the black box. So these are systems installed in planes that continually gather all kinds of information about the aircraft and its crew, from the altitude of the plane to the words spoken in the cockpit. In the event of failure, an abnormal landing, or even a crash, the information gathered by the black box is analyzed to try and understand what went wrong. So rather than blaming this or that, the culture in aviation, kind of like you're alluding to, is one of learning from failure and improving based on what was learned. In large part, it's this culture that is responsible for the incredible safety standards in commercial aviation. And that's, of course, as well where the name black box thinking gets, well, where the book gets its name. It's, in essence, the book covers a diverse set of stories about various people, industries, companies, policymakers, and more, looking at different ways that they deal with failure. So there's those that repeat mistakes because they fear failure or can't face the reality of failure due to some traumatic circumstance. And these are generally people with a fixed mindset. And he talks about this being stuck in a closed loop, not allowing feedback from the outside world, and especially not allowing feedback from failure. And so not learning from those failures, repeating the same mistakes over and over. And then on the opposite side of the spectrum, there are those that are willing to learn from failure, taking in the feedback and adapting over time. So these are generally people with a growth mindset, and they are in, again, what he calls open loop systems. So these are systems that accept failure as a normal part of life and then take the feedback from that failure and learn and improve. And like we spoke about, that aviation is a prime example of that. So the book's key insight is that success, even at a high performance, doesn't come from being a gifted genius, but rather it comes from a willingness to repeatedly learn from failure, making marginal improvements that compound over time. And there's lots of different aspects and various things that the book touches on, but overall, we'll repeat it again and again, learning from failure. It's very difficult, but one of the key things.
Yeah, the biggest takeaway.
Exactly. Okay, so starting off, let's look at the chapter or the first sort of section. And that section compares the aviation industry to the medical field and how they approach failure in different ways.
Yeah.
And some of the things that they touch on there is they give an example of a routine operation, and United Airlines, which 173, which is an airline that's sort of well known apparently in the aviation industry, but it's a helpful example from learning from failure. So I think let's dig into that. I don't know if you want to touch on some
go for it,
thoughts
and then I'll chip in with what I need to add.
Cool. So I've got here a note, but maybe before I do that, some background on these stories. So the story from the medical field, I'm going to paraphrase most of the stuff I say, so give me some lenience. But essentially, the story in the medical industry goes something along the lines of a woman goes in for a routine operation and there's nothing really majorly wrong with her. And she goes in for this op. Everything's kind of expected to go fine. But it turns out that when they are doing the operation, there's some small complications that come about. And then they run into another complication, and then they run into another complication. And what ends up happening is that the patient passes away because they kept on running into these issues. But when the husband found out about this, it turns out is from an aviation background. And so he was used to this concept of not blaming people for what went wrong. Mistakes happen in life, but rather saying what actually went wrong and trying to identify and see if there's anything that can be learned from that. And it turns out that in that procedure, what had happened, and again, I forget the details, but what had happened was they ran into these issues at various stages.
So they were trying to intubate, I think. So the airway was blocked. So they kept trying to do different things, and I think one of them was I think it's a tracheotomy or something, where
cut the
throat,
and to be able to put the pipe in.
And what had happened was the nurse had alerted them that they're running out of time, but the doctors, since they were so focused, they thought they've been at it for a few minutes or
a fraction of the time they had actually been.
And as a result, when they made the call to stop the operation, it was actually a little too late. Brain had been deprived of oxygen for far too long. Carry on.
I think that was helpful. And then I think the key point there is that there was this distortion of time, and that's an issue, obviously. Now, in the aviation industry, they try to learn from things like that, whereas in the medical industry, it's because of various factors that are very complicated, and it's not like there's blame on individual doctors or anything like that. It's a cultural issue. And again, that's not adds a few caveats here, because it's going to sound, especially in the beginning part, it's going to sound like we're attacking the medical industry. But again, this is about learning from failures. And so this is just an illustration. It's not to say that the whole medical system is flawed and this and that. And it's also not to say that the whole aviation industry is perfect. But in summary, that idea of learning from failure and saying what actually went wrong there, and if they ended up listening to the nurse and realizing that the distortion of time was taking place, then they would have been able to do the I can't remember the tracheotomy, that fancy word. And then the patient probably would have been fine. Sure, they would have had a cut in their throat, but in general they would have been fine. And to learn from that failure. But if you end up just being like, complications happen, and which is true. It's a fair statement, but it also can cover up things that could have been learned from.
Yeah.
And it's also very difficult in that industry as well, because if you're a surgeon or something and someone dies at your hands, it's much more difficult to take that responsibility, because we don't want to believe that we're capable of making those kind of mistakes, but of course we are. But it's so
Yeah, unfortunately, as I say, we're not blaming doctors, but the culture kind of just promotes people kind of shifting the spotlight to something else. They don't want to be, like you said, if someone dies on the operating table, you don't want to bear that guilt and responsibility that you killed someone. So as a result, it's or due to medical complication, but never do they dive deeply into what was the cause of that complication. And again, like you said, that's not saying that there's anything wrong with medicine and aviation is the perfect system, but when something goes wrong in aviation, from what the book says, is that they try to scrutinize that as much as possible and see what they can do differently.
exactly.
And I mean, you're talking about that one flight. The one thing that they said was developed from that was calling out every single thing that you're doing, as you're going through a situation, and I mean, that's something that later on apparently was adopted in medicine as well, and yeah, I think the other thing is, and I don't think it's just a culture thing. I think it's a very human aspect, is the thing of hierarchy. I think one thing that was highlighted was that the nurse's voice wasn't heard. Not because she wasn't saying anything, but it was more like, we know better, and that problem also existed in aviation, where the captain thought, he makes all the calls but never listens to the first officer, and as a result, that's a fundamental issue across different boards, where it needs to be addressed that just because you're at the top, it doesn't mean you cannot learn from the bottom. I think that's one thing that comes in the way of a lot of people, that they don't want to be corrected by
authority.
The superior doesn't want to be called out by the
someone
junior,
other than
that's a mental shift that needs to happen. That's I guess that's what learning from failure is. You need to be able to accept that you're making a mistake from anyone, and then you respond to that accordingly. Sorry.
No, that's good. So maybe what I'll do is I'll contrast that quickly with the plane, and we kind of touched on a few aspects, but just because I think it's a helpful example. So what you were talking about there was with this airplane, United Airlines 173, I think. What happened there was the plane needed to go and land, or it was coming in for a normal landing. Everything was sort of fine and that. And then when they were going in for the landing gear, according to the systems, was not deploying. And so the pilots and them started trying to sort of reason what's happening and trying to resolve the issue. Long story short, they got really, like, they just couldn't figure it out, and time kept on passing by. And keep that in mind, that time passing by aspect, very similar to what happened in the medical example, and I think he contrasts that really well in the book. And time keeps passing by, and what ends up happening is that they're so focused on the landing gear not deploying that they lose track of time, and the fuel starts depleting. And I can't remember if it was the engineer or the co-pilot. I think it was the engineer was calling out the fuel readings at different intervals and things like that. And then eventually what they were doing is they were just busy circling around a nearby a city, I guess. I can't remember. And they circling, fuel depleting. And then the engineer's now starting to get a little bit frantic, but he also doesn't want to sort of scream at the pilot and things like that. And the pilot's extremely focused on trying to figure out what is happening with this landing gear. And eventually, when it's almost too late, what happens is that the pilot decides, okay, now we have to land the plane. Fuel is pretty much out. And so they don't have enough fuel to make it to the runway. So they find the nearest sort of opening and then they land there. I can't remember what happened, if they hit anything.
Yeah, it was a crash landing because, I think there were like 6 casualties.
Yeah, there was a few casualties. I think one of them was unfortunately the person calling out the fuel readings and things like that. And later on in sort of the I guess verbal integration, the verbal discussions and investigation and that, what they do is they obviously just do normal discussions with the pilots and ask them about what happened and things like that. And the pilot essentially said, I don't know what happened, but he was taking guesses at, like, it could have been the fuel, it could have been this, and he was thinking, like, the fuel depleted so quickly, it maybe there was a leak in the plane or something, and a few different reasons, and they were logical reasons because from his perspective, the fuel basically just vanished. But it turns out, after doing the further investigation, taking the black box data and all of that kind of stuff, it turns out that the landing gear actually was fine. Yeah. It was just a faulty reading on the...
Yeah, the light did not illuminate. That indicated that.
And so that's an interesting thing. But what's more interesting is that they realized that the fuel depletion was completely normal. And again, it came down to that idea of almost time dilation, where you just get lost in this focused world. And long story short, they learned from that, and it became part of regular practice to follow a bunch of different steps and things like that. But one of the things that came out of it was assertiveness training to basically make sure that the people that are communicating with the pilot, when there is challenges, that they feel that they can assert those different things. I think it was from that where the assertiveness training came from.
Correct.
Yeah, and it's interesting how that applies to the nurse example. And how those failures, same learning from failures, can actually be applied in these different ways. So yeah, it's a really great comparison, the way that they do it. I don't know if you want to touch on anything. There's 2 parts that are on the book that I'll quickly read through, but if there's anything you want to touch on before.
No, there's nothing else.
So the one part is page 17. They say, in a seminal book after Horam, Nancy Berlinger, a health research, so this is going back to the medical side, a health research scholar, conducted an investigation into the way that doctors talk about errors. It proved to be very eye-opening. Observing more senior physicians, students learn that their mentors and supervisors believe in, practice, and reward the concealment of errors. Berlinger writes, they learn how to talk about unanticipated outcomes until a mistake morphs into a complication. Above all, they learn not to tell the patient anything. Now, of course, that is maybe quite a harsh view of it. I'm sure that in many cases it's true and in many cases it's not true. But what's interesting is that there's various different aspects to it, but one of the problems is, of course, when they're covering it up, they therefore can't learn from failure. And because it becomes part of a culture to do that, that negatively impacts the progression and things. And there's examples later in the book of people pushing against that and trying to learn from failure to improve patient safety. And I think it's a Virginia State Hospital or something like that. That's Madison, something or other. And they do an incredible job there. And there's a guy that I think he had a personal trauma or something related to not learning from failure. And
no, his father died at the early age of 55 or tender age of 55, and then he's the one that then started or proposed the implementation of investigating when something goes wrong. And in the sense of, again, through I think an aviation example, then drafted this whole thing where I think it was called like an alert system in the hospital or something, where if there was a mistake, people needed to alert this sort of pipeline, and then and it also meant you could call out people. So it wasn't
not
you just reporting, but someone else could call you out on your mistake. And then apparently when they initially implemented it, they only got a few hits. Not many people were reporting until something happened, and I think a doctor came forward and publicly to acknowledge a mistake that they had made, and that from that, like, that shifted the culture completely. They saw a rise in people using this alert system and people actually doing something. And I know some in the book they said there was an issue with I think it was either ventilator or one of the medical equipment in terms of one of the
switches, and I think they correlated with
that switch was the manufacturer of that switch was the exact manufacturer of the switch and the light that was in the plane that went down. So like those subtle correlations in just how the world works.
I think that's a excellent point to raise, because I think that the switch example there, from what I remember, is that on some of the ventilators, you switch it up and it turns it on or something like that, and on other ventilators you switch it down and it turns on or does something.
That was a different thing, but it was a diode to regulate the flow of fluids to the body.
Yes.
So.
My memory is way better than mine.
So if you put it in the upright position, it was fine. But if you tend it, I think, 90 degrees clockwise, instead of what it was set to deliver, I think it was delivering either more or less of the fluids.
But on some machines it was the opposite of it. And they're basically the same machine, just from a different manufacturer or something. And then I think another example from the medical industry that they started learning from was based on those reports, they were getting, I can't remember, I think it was weird issues where they were giving patients the wrong treatments or the wrong medication or something, and it had to do with the color of so they had color-coded bands.
So
that
it was
they
in
put
medicine. I think it was do not resuscitate. So
yes, that's it.
They were color-coded, and the one nurse was colorblind.
Yes, exactly.
She was putting the wrong bands on. So they were just colored without any text on them, and then eventually they colored them and
put text. Which I mean is it's a super obvious, super simple thing.
But it slipped through the cracks up until this feedback loop was actually introduced.
Which is very cool. Okay, then going to the aviation example. So it says here, and it's part of what you were mentioning earlier. This is now a well-studied aspect of psychology. Social hierarchies inhibit assertiveness. We talk to those in authority in what's called a mitigated language. So that's touching on that assertiveness training idea. And then in the aviation example, the tank leaking, it says here, The leak was not in the tank, but in McBroom's sense of time.
Mm.
Only through an investigation from an independent perspective did this truth come to light. In healthcare, nobody recognized the underlying problem because, from the first person perspective, it didn't exist. That is one of the ways that these closed loops perpetuate. When people don't interrogate errors, they sometimes don't even know that they've made one, even if they suspect that they may have. So, yeah, I think that's a great sort of overview to those issues and the contrast between these two different industries. Cool. Okay, I don't know if there's anything else you want to touch on there.
No, I think that's me all booked out.
Then the next section is cognitive dissonance, and specifically looking at things like wrongful convictions. And just for some background, the book's got here. Cognitive dissonance is the term Festinger coined to describe the inattention we feel when, among other things, our beliefs are challenged by evidence. So that's page 81. So this section starts to touch on a bunch of different things related to cognitive dissonance, and often what they talk about in this, I think it's this chapter, is the idea of people who are convicted of crimes that they didn't commit, and then later on they look at DNA evidence and that, and realize that these people, the person actually didn't commit the crime. But what's remarkable as well is we start to see later in this confronting complexity, in the cognitive dissonance section, that they start talking about people getting, or their innocence gets proven, even though that they were convicted and maybe in prison for 10 years. And then the people who sentence them basically just say, no. That person's, I can't tell you why, but that person's definitely guilty. Yes. And that's that element of cognitive dissonance. And Festinger, the guy who coined that term, he did a series of studies that end up essentially showing this idea of what we expect people to do is basically just saying, oh, okay, well, obviously that I was wrong there, cool. But what ends up happening is people have this cognitive dissonance, and they basically can't deal with the fact that
they could have been wrong.
Yeah, they could have been wrong.
No, it seems like we attacking careers here, but it does say that one group of people that never accept the fact that they could have been wrong, in air quotes, is actually lawyers or people in the law field or judges, because it does say, like you're saying, okay, as much as I read of that section was the boy that was wrongfully convicted just for the fact that he had episodes of or outbursts of some sort.
Yeah, it was like psychotic episodes, I think.
Yeah. And when he came out that he was actually innocent, he was actually in jail for like another, I think, 5 or
6 years.
6 years.
Yeah, he was convicted of rape, and then DNA evidence later proved innocent, and then
from the time that came to light that he was innocent, they went back and forth for 6 years because people just couldn't come to terms with the fact that
he was innocent.
He was innocent.
Yeah,
or they didn't handle the evidence correctly enough to convict the right thing. And I mean, in that section, it talks about how people in law enforcement also struggle with the fact that they can be wrong. And this is just not. And again, like we say, it's sounding like it's mostly a culture thing. This goes as far as the person that makes the arrest, the person that conducts the investigation, to the proceedings in court, all those people stand by what they end up believing after they've heard the different sides, and can never ever think they could have made a mistake. So if later someone says, listen, your judgment here was incorrect, they'll stand by their judgment regardless, even in the face of evidence that clearly suggests otherwise, like in the case of that boy.
Yeah, because it's too overwhelming to accept that you could have been wrong in this instance, because you, in the police example, you've sentenced someone to spend years in prison when they were innocent. So you almost can't fathom that you could do something like that or make a mistake like that.
I think there was a line that was mentioned there, that you might not be guilty of this crime, but you're guilty of some other crime, which I thought was so ridiculous.
It's
that
justification of saying, look, I don't know what happened here, but have to be guilty.
You have to be guilty, and I'm like, that's just insane.
But I mean, I'm sure we do it in various ways. I mean, there's so many examples that they give here in the cognitive dissonance side. There's the police side of things, but there's the cult side of things, and there's just various ways that we shape our beliefs, and hopefully we don't do them in extreme ways, but I'm sure that we do it in various ways. There's an interesting part in the book on page 83 where it basically talks about reframing evidence based on our existing beliefs, and they do an interesting study. So I'll quickly scan through that. They say here, it's only when we have staked our ego that mistakes of judgment become threatening. That's when we build defense walls and deploy cognitive filters. And then it goes on to say, an experiment led by psychologist Carl Lloyd, in that experiment, volunteers were recruited who were either adamantly in favor of capital punishment or adamantly against it. Jumping a bit further down, it goes on to say, both seem to marshal well-researched evidence about the issue. But here's the thing. One report correlated all the evidence that called into question the legitimacy of capital punishment, while the other articulated the evidence that supported it. So basically, they have a bunch of evidence or papers and things like that saying in favor of capital punishment, these are all the reasons, and then they have another set of papers against capital punishment. And the whole experiment is designed so that both of these sets of researchers, it's very clear and it's very convincing on both sides. And then it goes on to say, from reading exactly the same material, the two groups moved even further apart in their views. They had each reframed the evidence to fit their pre-existing beliefs. Festinger's great achievement was to show that cognitive dissonance is a deeply ingrained human trait. The more we have riding on our judgments, the more likely we are to manipulate new evidence that calls them into question. So the moral of the story there is to be very cautious when our beliefs, in various ways, it can be religious beliefs, it can be beliefs in evidence, beliefs in the way that you approach things. When our beliefs are attacked, not even necessarily very forcefully attacked, it could just be attacked in the sense of presented with new evidence. When that happens, we need to resist the urge to reshape that evidence to fit our existing beliefs, and we need to try and force ourselves, and it's, I think, extremely difficult, but we need to try and force ourselves to learn from that new evidence. But our default human trait is to reshape that evidence to fit our existing beliefs. So yeah. Cool. Then there's another somewhat related story, which I think is really cool, and it's essentially about confirmation bias, and it ties back to that idea of cognitive dissonance. So a quick comment beforehand is that it's helpful to realize that avoiding failure in the short term, and this is from the book, avoiding failure in the short term has an inevitable outcome. We lose bigger in the long term. So it's just a quick little side caveat.
You know.
But then, then it goes here to say, so this is page 111, that confirmation bias is another of the psychological quirks associated with cognitive dissonance. The best way to see this or its effects is to consider the following sequence of numbers: 2, 4, 6. So now what you need to do is you need to try and uncover the underlying pattern in that sequence. And then what happens is most people playing the game come up with a hypothesis pretty quickly. They guess, for example, that the underlying pattern is even numbers ascending sequentially. Okay? And other possibilities, of course, the pattern might be even numbers, or the third number is the sum of the first two numbers, and so on. So those are other examples that it could be, but people come to the conclusion of what that pattern is about very quickly. And then they get given the chance to essentially try and confirm their hypothesis. And what happens is, the key question is, how do you establish whether your initial hunch is right? Most people, when they're given that opportunity, simply try to confirm their hypothesis. So if you think that the pattern is even numbers ascending sequentially, they will propose 10, 12, 14. And then this gets confirmed. And they will propose 100, 102, 104. After 3 such tests, most people are pretty certain that they have found the answer. Yet, they may be wrong. If the pattern is actually any ascending numbers, their guess will not help them. If they had used a different strategy, on the other hand, attempting to falsify their hypothesis rather than confirm it, they would have discovered far quicker the reality. If they had said or proposed 4, 6, 8, which fits the pattern, they would have found that their initial hunch was wrong. If they had followed up with saying 5, 2, 1, which doesn't fit, they would now be pretty warm. So, the guy Paul Schumacher, he says, the pattern is rarely uncovered unless the subjects are willing to make the mistakes. That is, to test the numbers that violate their beliefs instead of doing the opposite. So, this is the whole idea of that confirmation bias in action. If we decide to rather than look at the contradicting evidence and assess that and try and take that into account and say, let's test our beliefs, then that's more likely to result in us finding out the truth. But what most people do is they just use that confirmation bias. They say, oh, okay, it's they don't test the negative case. And so they don't find out the actual pattern. They find out part of it, but they don't find out the true pattern of just it's any ascending numbers. It doesn't matter. They add these other additional things. Which I think is a really great example. Cool. Then another interesting example. I don't know if you want to touch on anything else there.
No, nothing else. I think it'll be a lot of you as we go on.
No, that's chilled. Okay, so cognitive dissonance. So this was another interesting one, just talking about judges. So I'll read it quickly. It's from page 128 at the bottom there. So consider an experiment not on juries but on judges over a 10-month period. I don't know how I'm going to say this guy's name, but Syed Zanger, a neuropsychologist at Tel Aviv University, and colleagues analyzed the parole decisions of 8 Israeli judges. And I'm skipping a little bit ahead. Judges are supposed to be rational and deliberative. They are supposed to make decisions based on hard evidence. But Danziger found something quite different. If the case was assessed by a judge just after he had eaten breakfast, the prisoner had a 65% chance of getting parole. But as time passed through the morning and judges got hungry, the chances of parole gradually diminished to 0. Only after the judges had taken a break to eat did the odds shoot back up to 65%, only to decrease back to 0 over the course of the afternoon. Judges were oblivious to this astonishing bias in their deliberations. Criminologists and social workers were also unaware of it. But why? Because it has never been analyzed. Now, that is like wild to me. I remember the first time I heard it. I don't think I heard it in this book, but I was just like, this is nuts.
Yeah.
And it shows just how human most of the systems are.
Yeah.
And if we don't care to learn from failure, you can make unfathomably like bad decisions that have massive ramifications for yourself or other people.
Simply by not understanding what's causing it.
Yeah. And having those biases but not uncovering them because you're not analyzing the facts. And granted, it's very difficult to do that. But yeah, it's quite a thing.
Yeah, no.
That's for sure.
Yeah, it is.
So yeah. Okay, so going on to the next section. Confronting complexity. Okay, so this section deals with the fact that in the real world, life is very complicated and what we end up doing is we basically look at complexity and we choose to sort of ignore the difficulties there, and we try and pretend, or we end up pretending that we live in a world that's not complex, and we try and make judgments and do things based on the fact that the world is not complex, when in reality it is. So they have some interesting examples here, and one of them dealing with that confronting complexity is the nozzle paradox. Okay. So in Unilever, they needed to create a nozzle, design a nozzle, and the purpose of the nozzle is to create, I think it's washing powder. And in order to create washing powder, you basically blast out this, I suppose it's like a liquid, at a very high pressure, and then the water part separates from the sort of particles, and the particles fall into, I suppose, a vat, and then you have your washing powder. But they wanted to improve the efficiency of these nozzles, and get it to basically produce the washing powder. And so what they did, and Unilever at this time I think was quite a wealthy company, and so they hired a bunch of like really clever mathematicians that understood fluid dynamics and all kinds of fancy things, and they then said to these mathematicians, this is what we want to do, and the mathematicians sort of came up with these theories and took their fluid dynamics understandings and all that into play, and then they came up with these nozzle ideas, and when they tested them, they didn't work very well, and then they deliberated and had these sort of meetings to discuss possible options and etc. And then it says here, almost in desperation, Unilever turned to its team of biologists. These people had little understanding of fluid dynamics. What they would not have known a phase transition if it had jumped and bitten them. But they had something more valuable, a profound understanding of the relationship between failure and success. They took 10 copies of the nozzle and applied small changes to each one, then subjected them to failure by testing them. They then took the winning nozzle and created 10 slightly different copies, and they repeated this process. They repeated again and again. After 45 generations and 449 failures, they had a nozzle that was outstanding. Progress had been delivered not through a beautifully constructed master plan, there was no plan, but by rapid iteration or rapid interaction with the real world. So, yeah, often we think that, again, going back to the complexity idea, we often think that the world isn't as complex as we think, or as it is. And we think that we can come up with theories that are perfect and that cover every different aspect of the real world situation. And it turns out in most things in life, it's just not like that.
Yeah, impossible.
Yeah. And so what we need to learn to do is, not always, but much more than we expect, is to, instead of saying we can jump to some perfect answer if we have that right theory, we need to iterate through things.
Yeah.
And
solutions and
put those things in contact with the real world and say, how does this actually do? And try out different scenarios and then learn from that and improve based off of that. And I think that's a really helpful idea to understand. So there's other examples as well where so I'll touch on two other ones. Cool. The one is making ceramics. So I won't read it, but the essence of it is that on page 152 they start talking about, or I think it originally comes from the another book, the book is Art and Fear by David Bales and Ted Orland. So they get these students, I think, to design ceramics, and they get one group to basically focus on designing a pot or whatever it is, and they say you must focus on designing the perfect pot. I think it's a pot, but whatever it is. And you must focus on designing the perfect pot. The other group is given the task of saying, you need to design as many as you can. You don't need to worry about quality. You don't need to worry about that kind of stuff. Just make as many as you can. And the interesting result is, as we kind of would now start to expect, but you wouldn't necessarily expect this in the real world, or if you haven't sort of thought through and had the discussion we just had. But what it turns out is that when you're making these ceramics, and it applies to a bunch of different things, the quality came not from the group who made one and focused on quality. It came from the group that made many ones, because they kept on refining their processes, and whereas if you focused on just making that one perfect, you never learn from failure.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's a similar example in, I think, 4,000 Weeks, about, I think it was a photography lecturer gave an assignment that one group takes one perfect picture and the other goes wild to take a bunch of different pictures. I don't know if you remember.
I can't remember. It sounds possible, very possible.
But yeah, it's a similar thing. Yeah. That the ones that were focused on one, but actually didn't do as well as the ones that went out and took a whole bunch of photos. So it's a similar principle.
Very well,
that again, like you're saying, you take a picture, you're like, oh, this lighting isn't great. What can I adjust to make it better and all that? And I guess it's the same with ceramics. You either you had more water when more than the one thing, and which you never learn if you're just going to work on one. You never know if it'll burst once you put it in the furnace. And
no, it's true. Learning from failure.
Yeah.
We'll say it over and over again, but it's true. Another way of learning from failure, so it's tying back to this confronting complexity, is there's an example where they, and again, I'm going to paraphrase it here, but I think it was, I don't know if it was a state or city or something, that wanted to reduce smoking and try and improve health in that way and various things. And so what they ended up doing was they reduced the amount of nicotine in cigarettes, theorizing that if they reduce the nicotine in cigarettes, then people will smoke less because it's going to be less addictive. Backfired terribly because what ends up happening is that people end up smoking more to get that nicotine. And I mean, that's what happens if you put things into the real world and you say, okay, let's see what happens. Those are the crazy, weird things that will happen.
No one will think of that on the fly. Only after you've put it to practice where like, okay, this is a good or bad idea.
Yeah, exactly. So that's been very interesting. Okay, so then going on to another idea, there's we spoke briefly about the Scared Straight program, and that is an incredible story, and he gives a really convincing and good account of it in the book, where the general idea is you have these group of kids, and you want to try and make sure that these kids don't commit serious crimes and things like that. So it started off, as far as I understand, with a group of sort of somewhat rebellious kids that had done misdemeanors and things like that. So maybe like robbing a shop or breaking into a house and stealing something. And what they did with these kids is they took them to this serious prison where there's people that are in for murder and rape and this and that, and they basically tried to scare these kids straight. So the prison guards would shout at the kids and say all kinds of vile things and stuff, and the kids, the way that he conveys it in the book is that these kids go in thinking like, oh, I'm way too cool for this, I don't really care, nothing's gonna worry me about this and affect me. And they end up coming out of the prison basically traumatized. On the way home, one of the kids even like throws up because he's so like traumatized, and that's the story that he sort of lays out here. And they have a bunch of documentaries, and the whole idea of the Scared Straight program, it becomes a program that they start rolling out to a bunch of different regions and that. And the narrative around it is so powerful because you want your children not to commit serious crimes and things like that. And so exposing them to what prison is really like and the scary, crazy stuff that happens there would hopefully scare the kids straight. And what ends up happening is they, through what he refers to in the book as the narrative fallacy, basically telling a story and making it sound convincing, and a bunch of people, including most likely if you and I had watched it, we would have thought the same thing. Scared Straight program, it's great, bring it to our area and that as well. And it gets rolled out, like I said, and it turns out that after doing randomized controlled trials on the program, it actually doesn't work. Not only doesn't it work, it actually has the opposite effect. So the book says here, to glimpse the often mind-bending gulf between what we think and what we know, and what we think we know and what we really know. Let's revisit the Scared Straight program. And he goes blah 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 blah, and then it says here, Scared Straight program is a metaphor, but above all, it's a warning. And it's a warning about that learning from failure, because the Scared Straight program basically got these kids the complete opposite effect of what they wanted. So I'm going to jump back and forth here very quickly, but they say here, in a meta-analysis, when the Campbell collaboration arrived at the scene, this this is a global non-profit organization devoted to evidence-based policy. They conducted what's called a systematic review. This is where the data from all the randomized trials are collected into a single spreadsheet. By pooling the results from all the individual trials, 7 were used in the so-called meta-analysis. A systematic review represents the gold standard when it comes to scientific evidence. This is the ultimate failure test. Forgive me if you know what's coming, but the results were emphatic. The Scared Straight program doesn't work. It increases crime. And some research indicates that the increases can be as high as 28%. The Scared Straight was in many ways ahead of its time. Unlike most social programs, which collect no data whatsoever, it actually sent out questionnaires and gathered statistics. But as with the medieval bloodletting, observational stats do not always provide reliable data. Often, when you test, you need the counterfactual. So that's the you can think of it like the control group and that kind of thing. Otherwise, you may be harming people without realizing it. It's just that contrast for when we get given a narrative and we have observational statistics, such as going to the parents of those kids and saying, how's your kid doing? And then they report back and they say, no, my kid's doing great. But then it turns out that in some sense, of course, the parents would say that they want to believe that their kid is doing better.
Yeah.
And so the observational statistics and the narrative can skew the actual reality.
Yeah.
And so as he mentions there, as with bloodletting, we need that randomized control trial in order to determine what is the reality. So just to quickly touch on the idea of bloodletting. So bloodletting is, in the past, they used to drain people of their blood, and then people used to think that this was a great medical intervention because what happens is observationally people would get better. But as we discussed a little bit earlier, people they aren't taking into account.
They ignore the people that died.
Exactly, yeah. So without taking those people into account, you have a skewed perspective of reality. And so, long story short, randomized control trials came about, and then in the medical field, they realized that, bloodletting, rather than helping people, is actually killing people. But to realize that is really difficult, and to actually change that is even more difficult because people believe that it works. And now, obviously, to us, we say, oh, of course it doesn't work. Why would you think that works? But reality isn't always that simple. Okay. Yeah. I don't know if you want to add anything else.
No, I have nothing to add.
Cool. Okay, then the next one was the small steps and giant leaps. So we also talked about that a bit. So I don't know if you want to talk through the peaks and things. Should we talk through that?
We can go through that. You can go for it.
Okay. So basically, the chapter's called, or the section is, I think it's called the part, is called Small Steps and Giant Leaps. And then there's different pieces in there. They talk about marginal gains. They talk about how failure drives innovations. And there's a really helpful story about marginal gains in this British cycling team. So there's a British, long story short, the British cycling team none of them had won any serious races like the Tour de France and things like that.
I think Atomic Habits had this story as well.
Yeah, they had a very similar one, yeah. And this team had been struggling, or a bunch of cycling teams had been struggling, and no one really won, and British cycling was kind of like a whatever kind of thing. And then they got this guy on board, Railsford, and he managed to get the team to compete internationally and to end up winning various things. I don't know. I think they won the Olympic gold medal in various things, and basically went from being cycling nobodies to being like the pinnacles.
Yeah.
And they say here, how did Brailsford conquer not just one cycling discipline but two? These were the questions I asked him over dinner at the team's small hotel after the cycle tour, after a tour of the cycle facilities. His answer was clear. It was about marginal gains, he said. The approach comes from the idea that if you break down a big goal into small parts and then improve on each of them, you will deliver a huge increase when you put them all together. So just that general idea of marginal gains, I think is helpful to keep in mind for various obvious reasons. But there's also the idea of, so there's these two pieces of the puzzle if you want to separate it out like that. The one piece of the puzzle is taking these small steps to get to some point. But the problem is, and they convey this well in the book, when you're doing the marginal gains approach, you can only get so far.
Yeah.
And there's this other aspect where it's almost innovation.
Yeah.
And you need to make these giant leaps.
Or more like practice, if you may. In the sense that when you get to a certain point, you don't just stop there. You kind of have to be, I am here, doesn't mean, you can stay there, but there are two effects that may happen. So that you're going down or you're going up. And the only way to go up, and again, with your marginal gains, I'll call it a theory, it's that the small changes and tweaks and the practice, the whole, if I do this differently, that's then what helps you reach your peak. You don't reach your peak by doing nothing. You don't do the initial work and get to your peak.
Yeah. You have to keep on iterating and keep on just pursuing that learning from failure.
And just going back to that British cycling team, if yes, like I said, from Atomic Habits, it says they started with, I think, using lighter bikes, but that only got them so far. But they went all up to even like changing the suit they wear, and all those things, like just
vacuuming the rooms before they enter them.
Just those small, like just feeling bad, like people underestimate that the thing, again, like you said, the big changes happen by significantly changing something. It's literally a tiny tweak or something, like for instance, like that whole judges thing, like who would have thought that having a meal, betters your chances of, before a parole board, like it's stuff like that. So even if the cyclists, like, you can practice once a week, okay, that's all well and done, but you'd be like, okay, let's practice every day. It might not be that you're doing anything different, but just that discipline and consistency. I think men needs that consistency, and also being able to have that feedback, like you say, like, this hasn't been working, we've been doing this for so long, and this is where we rank. What can we do differently to better achieve the best potential from ourselves?
And all of those aspects are talking about, so again, the title of this part is Small Steps and Giant Leaps. And all of that we've been talking about now is talking about the small steps. And to look at the giant leap part, they give a great example or a great illustration. I wish I could show everyone the picture, but the picture's on 203, and they have this picture, and you can almost imagine it as these mountains, and there's two little mountains. The one is slightly smaller than the other mountain. And you can picture yourself as being on the first mountain, and you're not quite at the top of the mountain. You're somewhere sort of in the middle of the mountain. And those marginal gains, those small steps, what they will do is they will help you to summit the top of that mountain that you're on. But there's another aspect, which is if you keep on going and you keep on improving, at some point you reach the pinnacle of a certain peak, right? But innovation might be something along the lines of a completely different peak. You have to have a completely different approach to doing something.
Yeah.
Maybe originally, I don't know, this probably won't be a great analogy, but maybe you originally are writing mathematical equations on a piece of paper, and then over time you realize like, oh, I could actually, like, this is very slow and it takes me days to calculate things that I need to calculate. And then over time you start to explore different ideas, and you might improve a lot on being super efficient at doing those sums, but without coming up with some completely different innovation like a computer. And that's not the way that the computer came about, but just as an analogy, without coming up with a completely different innovation like a computer, there's only so much that you can do in terms of performance. There's a certain limit. But when it comes to innovation, the giant leaps, that takes something else. And what he talks about here in the book is that surprisingly, it's the same sort of underlying principle, learning from failure. So without having run into that failure, the failure in my example, fictitious example, of struggling to calculate more than a certain number of calculations in a day, when you run into that limitation, without that limitation, there wouldn't have been an incentive to come up with this novel idea of the computer. Again, a fictitious example. And so what we start to see is that marginal gains are extremely helpful to get to some pinnacle of some point. But we need to be able to take these creative leaps. And in order to do that, we can also use that principle of learning from failure. There's a bunch of other things that he touches on. For example, things like the idea that innovation is contextual as well, because what you'll notice is things like Einstein and them coming up with their theories. People often think, oh, if he came up with his theory 300 years before, we would have been so much better off. But the reality is he couldn't have really come up with that theory because because there was a lot of foundations that had to be done. And importantly, the foundational work was done and it got us to a certain point. But when that point started failing, that's when, say, for example, Newton's theories and stuff started failing to answer the questions that we were asking at that time, then it starts to point us in the direction of saying, okay, this is failing, but let's try and explore this or that. And to overcome those little, to jump from the one mountain to the other in the image, what the important piece is, one, contextual, but the other is connecting disparate or different ideas. And so what you'll notice is that very often when people have innovation, jumping from that one peak to a completely new place, it's when they're joining ideas from completely different industries in novel and interesting ways to solve an underlying problem. So looking at that, the great example that they use here is James Dyson. So guy creates vacuum cleaners and does a bunch of interesting things. And he, with his Dyson vacuum cleaners, his sort of great innovation there, and the reason why it became so successful, and Dyson's basically like a household name, and it's known for some of the best vacuum cleaners in the world, is because he ran into a failure of existing vacuum cleaners. So it was his chore to do vacuuming when he was young, and I think he had like a very powerful vacuum cleaner, but even with that vacuum cleaner, after a moment, 5 minutes or something, the vacuum cleaner's suction power drops like crazy. Long story short, it turns out it's because there's bags in vacuum cleaners and the dust clogs up the bags. But it's not just the normal dust, it's these fine little particles of dust that sort of almost seal off the bag. And that blocks the suction power. And then he had been bugged by this for many years, and he was one day going to get wood cut, and he saw I don't know what's a sawmill thing.
Yeah.
And what he saw is that there was all of these wood filings flying around, but then at the top of this chimney, somehow, there was no wood filings. Like all of them had somehow stopped going out. But the interesting thing that he noticed is that unlike the vacuum cleaners, these things work all day and they don't stop. And it turns out that he went back home and built cardboard mock-ups and things like that and tested them out, where you basically channel the air in certain ways that it slows down certain particles and that. And the idea of a cyclone is what solved his problems. And he was joining his problem of vacuum cleaning with this solution in a completely different industry together to solve the problem. And it's that idea of connecting these different things to be able to make that leap from the one to the next hill or mountain is a very powerful idea. But it's fascinating things there.
Where ideas come from, strangest places.
And being open to learn from those different places is a necessary thing, rather than just fixating on one specific area.
It's more like promoting living outside the box in a way, don't confine yourself to one sector, essentially. You don't know where you draw inspiration from.
Exactly. And Dyson, I mean, he has a lot of amazing stories and examples that he gives, but I find his story quite interesting as well, because of the fact that he made these connections and he's done a bunch of interesting things. But then, he talks about how to get to that original vacuum cleaner, he had to go through 5,000 iterations, and he ran into a bunch of different issues and all kinds of different things. And at one point he had one cyclone at the time, but then he was finding that certain particles and things like hair and stuff would still get through the system. And he ended up realizing he could add, and that's where the dual cyclone thing comes in, and he could add another thing and then solve this issue and that. And he kept on running to new issues and solving them and carrying on. And the amazing part about that is that it starts to surface this concept of not only do you need to be able to learn from failure and have resilience in the face of failure, but in order to actually end up solving the problem, you need to have, in some sense, almost like a grit to just grind through. They mention another book, literally by the title, Grit, sort of touching on that. But you have to have this grit to end up solving that problem, and realizing that without that grit, what you end up is just having a patent that you file the patent and you sort of leave it there and then it's cool, but you make nothing of it. But if you have that grit with that learning from failure, joining these different ideas and having that creative inspiration, then you end up being able to create the product. And the example that he gives here is also quite wild. He says, good ideas are not, so it ties back to a few different things about the innovation in context of different ideas and times in history and all of that, and then Dyson stuff. And then it says here, as Johnson writes, good ideas are not conjured out of thin air. Dyson is well aware of this aspect of creativity. He says, every time I've gone for a patent in a particular field, someone else has gotten there first. He says, I don't think that there's been a single time in the thousands of patents that I've filed where we were the first. With the vacuum cyclone, there was already a number of patents lodged. But this raises another obvious question. Why didn't the person who came up with the original idea for the vacuum cyclone go on to make a fortune? We noted earlier that we tend to overlook what happens before the moment of epiphany. But, if anything, we are even more neglectful of what happens afterwards. This is a serious oversight because it obscures the reason why some people change the world while others are footnotes in a patent catalog. So it's that combining those ideas of not just learning from failure and reaching those summits,
the persistence that comes with first failure. I think, again, talking about culture shifts, don't let failure demotivate you, but rather, be a stepping stone or motivating factor to try and achieve, what you're trying to achieve.
There's a lot of little things that come into success and failure. But I think that the book touches on a lot of helpful aspects to it.
I don't know which book we read, but it kind of alluded to the fact that you need to fail a few times before you succeed.
Yeah, only a few. No, it's true.
Many times,
There's a great example as well in the world of education. This comes from a different book. It's referenced here, but it comes from the book Adapt by Tim Harford, and I think we should also read that book at some stage. It seems like a really, really interesting one. And this is regarding improving education. So I'll again sort of run through it quickly and paraphrase things. But what initially they did in this trial was they were giving out free textbooks to this underprivileged area. I can't remember where it was, in Africa or something like that. They were giving these textbooks to this underprivileged area, thinking and assuming that giving these textbooks to them is going to help them with education. And obviously, again, thinking about observational data and just purely using that alone, most likely what you would get is, it's great that we have these books, etc., etc. And then, again, thinking about the narrative fallacy and falling into that, it's a nice narrative. We're giving textbooks, we're doing good things, I'm putting my money towards that. It must be helping. Of course, textbooks would help, etc., etc. But what they decided to do was actually to do a study on it. And it turned out that, and it's this group of economists that do the study, and they found out, okay, it didn't work. The textbooks don't really improve the grades. I think they probably did a RTC randomized control trial, RCT randomized control trial. But they found out, okay, no, this giving the books, strangely enough, doesn't work. After probing a bit deeper, it turns out that English is these people's third language. So the books weren't really helping. So they came up with a new idea. They decided to give them visual aids. So instead of using books, rather just put the money towards visual aids. Again, they do a bunch of tests and things like that. and they find out, no, this isn't actually working either, which again is very interesting because again, the narrative would have been like, of course it will work. Like they couldn't read, that makes sense. Of course, okay. Long story short, that didn't work either, and they started thinking outside of the box, joining those different ideas and piecing things together. And so what they did was they gave them deworming tablets. And the deworming tablets ended up actually having a significant result, because it turns out that in that area, worms and things like that was a big problem, and it would cause people to be overly tired and all kinds of things. And so rather than giving some direct educational thing, it turns out that deworming is the answer to an education problem. And that's wild. But it just shows you how I feel like I've used this word a lot today, how powerful it is to learn from failure and be resilient in trying to really drill down on saying, does this actually work?
And also understanding what the real issue is. Because we're so quick to be like, oh, there's a problem, let's find the solution.
Here's the obvious solution.
You know, but without actually understanding what is the root cause. You know,
Yeah, so I mean, we have a lot to learn in terms of how we can approach failure and improve on these various aspects. Okay, then the sort of second last section is the blame game. So yeah, I think looking at that, and again, we talked about it earlier, when we think about what is helpful and constructive in trying to get some group of people or company or something to behave in a certain way, we often think that pinning blame on the people that did the wrong thing is the solution, and pressing down on them, that's going to solve the problem. And they give a great example there of the social workers. So what ends up happening is there was a situation in the news where social work, there was abuse of a child. I think the child was killed by the parents and a brother or something like that. And then the social worker that was assigned to them basically something didn't work out there. I can't remember if the social worker was actually to blame or not, but the point of the story was the social worker got pinned with a ton of blame, and the media, as the media can at times do, can be helpful at times, but at times it can take these stories and twist them like crazy, basically put so much public blame on the social worker that what ended up happening was social workers in that area started quitting and stuff, because they were worried that if they make any little mistake, that now they might be publicly shamed and get taken to prison or this or that. And so what I can only assume the public and media thought that they were doing by pushing the blame on this person is trying to point out fault and say, this is bad, we need to do better than this, which seems reasonable. But putting yourself in the shoes of the social workers, that's traumatizing. And it's like, oh my gosh, like I can't do anything wrong here, or else I'm going to be majorly in trouble. So people start quitting, people start being less involved with their social work so that they have less culpability and all kinds of things. And so it ends up backfiring rather than helping. And they give a bunch of different examples in this blame game chapter where pinning the blame on people, you would think in for example, a company, someone does something wrong. There's I think the example that they use is in software development. There was issues with this program, and it was some financial trading program, and it lost the company a bunch of money. And naturally, software systems are extremely complicated, and software developers are responsible, but at the same time, there's only so much that a human being can understand. And so what ended up happening was the board or the CEOs and that, I don't know exactly who it was, pinned the blame on the software developers because it was an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
Also, from a public perspective, it helps to sort of say, oh no, look guys, we're dealing with who's at fault here, they're going to be fired and stuff like that. Internally in the company, some people are like, no, these people shouldn't be fired because look, software is complicated and this and that. But they went forward with the pinning the blame on the software developers and basically thinking, okay, well, if we get rid of these people that make the mistakes and stuff like that, or if we put pressure on them to be perfect, then it will solve our problems and our software will be perfect. Of course, it didn't work out like that, as we would now realize. That was one major incident that they ran into. Later on, they ran into another 6 or 7 major incidents because now there's no ability to learn from failure. Because now, if you actually do make a mistake, and it's a genuine mistake, not a purposeful, neglectful mistake, you're not going to be like, yeah, I made a mistake, because you're going to be pinned. And so you end up not sharing anything, which means all of the small little issues get hidden under the rug and bigger issues arise. But if we don't do that, if we don't play the blame game, but rather just have open, honest discussions about the failure,
things would be different.
It goes a long way. Yeah. Cool. Then, lastly, is the creating of a growth culture. So there's not too much, because we've already been through a lot of it. But in essence, just the general idea of redefining failure. So taking it from this thing of bad, don't fail, you can't fail, to being like, okay, humans fail. How can we learn from those failures and be open about those failures? And we need to, as human beings, in our families, in our companies, all kinds of places, in the policies that are made. So it's not just like you and I, it's policymakers, it's global organizations, it's our small little companies that we work for, need to accept that failure is a part of the thing and not be neglectful and things like that, but be open to the fact that people fail, people make mistakes, and learning from those mistakes is the way forward. Otherwise, we just end up doing bloodletting. And it seems like it's working, it seems like it's fine, but actually it's killing people.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, James.
Yeah. Some concluding thoughts?
I think I'm trying to challenge myself a little bit more as well. Be open about failure, I mean, there's no point reading and not actually applying. So I'm actually trying to take that leap myself. Especially at work, if you make a mistake, say, this is the mistake I made, I need assistance. Or, when you know that you failed a few times, don't just put rocks against rocks expecting a solution, Be able to say, listen, yes, you paid to do this, but at the same time, like, if you can't do it, it doesn't mean you don't know. It just means that you just don't have the best way out of that. And someone might have failed in a similar manner and succeeded eventually. So rather ask, So just don't be so hard on ourselves when we fail.
Yeah,
I think that's one thing, trying to shift that culture that failure is bad. Yes, failure is bad, but try to see what good can come from failure itself.
I mean, I would almost say that failure isn't bad. It's just a natural part of things. And in some senses, that shift is to say, rather than seeing it as this negative thing, seeing it as this thing that we can learn from. So
those are my thoughts. And yours?
I basically just end off with maybe 2 quotes here. So one is, to leverage the power of failure, you have to be resilient and open. In other words, you have to have the right mindset as well as the right system. So I think touching on that resiliency is also key to we can't, it's not like there's going to be 1 or 2 failures. You're going to run into thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of failures. And so being willing to face that and embrace that and being like, cool, this is an opportunity to learn, rather than, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. Shifting from that fixed mindset to that growth mindset, the closed loop to the open loop. That's the one thing. And then the last thing I'll end off with, another quote, is this, and again, super helpful, super obvious, especially in light of all the things we've discussed. But this is the paradox of success. It's built upon failure. Cool.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
Peter.
Thank you.
We'll chat again.
Cool.
Cheers.
Cheers.